Today we're going to talk about listening, which is chapter 4. I think listening is one of the most taken for granted parts of communication in an interpersonal relationship, something that we do mindlessly and something that we need to begin to do actively. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we listen versus hearing, and then some of the barriers that we might encounter, and then how to be more effective, active listeners. So I had posed some questions to you in my PowerPoint slides about some of the implications of listening. So what does it mean to be a good listener or not a good listener in a relationship? How does the role of silence and then response impact your relationships? Is a question you might want to consider. So in terms of what we do every day, statistics and research says that we roughly listen 60% of our day. As a college student, it's probably more than that. You're probably listening a good 80% of your day. So if we're listening that much, we want to at least be good at it. So how can we be more appropriate and effective in the way that we listen? That's what we're going to try to learn about today. So it's important at home, at work. In terms of work, I raised some percentages to you when I said think about this. So 60% of a manager's day is spent listening. So if you are constantly listening to people, trying to resolve issues and problems, how do you do that in an effective way so that you can be productive and come up with positive solutions while maintaining a positive work environment? That's tough. That's a lot of responsibility. Most people say that the most important communication skill is really listening, but it's also the hardest to master. And there's lots of statistics about how much we actively retain when listening, and it's actually pretty sad, and how much of our ability to listen that we actually use. So a statistic from 2000 says that most Americans spend the majority of their communication time listening, but only use 25% of their innate ability to listen. So what are we doing the rest of the time? Probably not something constructive. So it's important to understand the stages of listening so that you can be more effective in terms of listening. So your book laid out the different stages. So the first is receiving. So you have to, and think about this in relation to the communication model that we talked about in the first week of class. So the sender is going to put together, encode a message that they're going to then relay via a channel or medium to the receiver. Right? And then the job of the receiver is to decode that message and try to make sense of it. So something has to pique our attention, and we have to realize that a message is being sent. So when that's happening, you want to try to avoid interrupting the person, paying attention, and avoid assuming that you understand what's being said, because oftentimes we don't, and that can lead to miscommunication. So once you receive the message, then the cognitive process of understanding goes on. So trying to make sense of the message in the way that it was intended. So again, your book has some recommendations. So not jumping to conclusions, avoiding judgment, trying to rephrase or paraphrase, and ask questions to clarify. So you mean, or what you were trying to say is, or, can you please repeat what you were trying to say? That becomes important. And then obviously remembering is important because we want to remember and recall the information at some point. So how do we put the information in our short-term or long-term memory? One way to do this is to think about what you're listening to in the message. So focusing on main ideas, trying to organize and categorize what you're hearing into some of your pre-existing mental schemas that we talked about, relating new and old information, and repeating things over and over to yourself, key concepts, ideas. Obviously, extremely important if you're going to take a test, right? You need to remember and recall that information. And then we go into the evaluative piece when listening. So judging the message. And this shouldn't be done until the end of the message, ideally, so that you can distinguish fact from opinion and come to a conclusion based on the evidence provided instead of what you thought was said. Also, then we want to respond. Extremely important. So how can you respond after you listen? You should be supportive. You should acknowledge you're listening. So there's some nonverbal cues you need to give. Thinking about those back channeling cues that you're giving. You can ask for clarification, express your support. So think about all the things that you'd want done to you if someone was listening. What would make you feel comfortable or more comfortable? What would create a scenario in which you would want to tell someone something more, right? If you can recreate that for someone else, then you're being a good listener. But what happens are there are various barriers that come into play that make us not a good listener and not engage in all of those steps we just talked about in an effective, appropriate way. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's important to know what might get in the way of you being an effective listener. So sometimes we are in a room that's extremely noisy or hot, or we're hungry, right? So these physical distractions can impede our listening. We can have things going on, so we're mentally distracted. We have biases about the person speaking already or the subject, so we just don't listen completely. And that makes us form premature judgments. Also, not engaging in the correct style of listening can be a problem. So your book outlines the different styles of listening. So when you know the different styles of listening, you then know how to properly respond if you're listening in a particular way. So your book talks about empathetic and objective listening, which is very different than, let's say, surface and depth listening, thinking about how to be non-judgmental and critical in your listening, being polite versus impolite listening. There are often people that you know of probably who you would say, oh my gosh, they always interrupt me, or they never maintain eye contact, right? Being impolite, not showing empathy. And then being an active listener, which we talked about. It's an important skill. So thinking about being an active listener is like, it's the same difference as seeing versus observing, right? So active listening requires that you're listening, not just hearing, right? Hearing being the physical act that occurs when the sound wave hits your eardrums, right? That's not enough. The listening is the meaning-making process, where also with seeing is you're just viewing something as opposed to observing, where you're attaching meaning to the visual stimuli and trying to make sense of what's going on. So things you need to do to be a better listener is check your understanding, paraphrasing, expressing your understanding with your speaker's feelings, asking questions, considering culture and how culture might impact listening as well, different language styles, direct and indirect styles, accents can play a role, and then gender as well. So your book has a little section on rapport versus rapport type of talk and listening cues. Extremely important to consider. So why do people talk? And when they talk, what are they expecting in terms of a response? So that's where the listening piece comes in. So being mindful of these similarities and differences in an interpersonal interaction is extremely important. And I think if you consider it, you'll then be a much more effective and appropriate speaker and listener.